I think we can all recognize that finding truth is increasingly challenging. Whoever you are, there's just so much noise out there that's now unfiltered. People are calling it an infodemic. So it's hard to separate fact from fiction, whoever you are. That's on one side of things. And then on the other is the fact that there's a growing inaccessibility of science. Increasingly, you have to have specialist expertise to be able to access the science and critically appraise it, which is fundamentally important. A lot of people don't recognize the huge rise in bad science and why it's a problem. A rise in predatory journals and research fraud that's even turning up in well-respected journals like Elsevier. And so to be able to spot the bad science, you have to be able to critically appraise it, which is very hard for most people. A general science background generally isn't enough. For example, if I were to try to read a study about neuroscience, something that I don't have a background in, I would have a very hard time doing that. To get to the truth then, because doing your own research is probably not going to lead you in the right direction. You might just end up confirming your biases. You have to find trusted sources. That's also really, really hard because the public, by and large, doesn't understand relevant expertise. So I think that's kind of step one for finding truth, is understanding the relevant expertise so that you can find consensus amongst those experts. But looking at cosmetics, it's such an interdisciplinary space, but the consumers often feel that, for example, dermatologists are the one true expert for cosmetics. It's something that comes up a lot on social media. So then there's some dermfluencer talking about how cosmetics are unregulated, and then they're just taken for their word. But had the public known that they're not actually the relevant experts for that topic, then they probably wouldn't have believed it, because there's actually regulatory people that would be the more relevant expert. The appeal to misinformation is that it fits with our biases. There's so much noise out there. There's so much information. So biases help us make quicker decisions, but unfortunately, those quick decisions often lead us astray. For example, we have a bias for simple information. But like I said, the reality is complex, and so that's competing against that simplicity bias. Or a bias for negativity. And so you can see the traction that fear marketing has had. When we're fearful, we're less likely to pause and more likely to share. And as a consequence, biases shape what gets engagement on social media, where misinformation spreads farther, faster, and more broadly compared to truth. This also impacts what gets visibility in traditional media outlets who are increasingly competing with social media platforms. And it's also impacting science, where scientists need funding, but to get funding, they need attention. And so now we have this huge issue of science sensationalism that's driving bad science, and a lot of the public just a lot of even scientists don't recognize these issues. Misinformation is often also very hard to spot. So highlighted on the screen is an entry of the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database entry on methylparaben. I reviewed it before the pandemic, so it might look a little different now. But as I reviewed it, I noticed a trend where they were misrepresenting their citations. Maybe they were using inappropriate references for the things that they were talking about, using out-of-date, poor quality studies. Sometimes they actually used higher quality studies, but they just ignored it for the areas that disagreed with them. What they're doing is they're cherry picking, and that is a red flag for pseudoscience. Unfortunately, it's becoming harder for the public to differentiate pseudoscience from legitimate science. This is especially the case in areas that aren't our expertise. Me finding this trend required me, as somebody who has relevant enough expertise, reading through all the references to see if it matched what they were saying. No one has time for that, let alone the expertise. That's a small group of people that have that relevant expertise. So the impact of misinformation in beauty can start to be teased apart via a behavioral science concept called habit loops, where they create reinforcing cycles that make misinformation snowball. And so habit loops are recurring cycles with 3 stages. The first is a cue. So you see that sulfate-free product on the shelf, and you assume that it must be better. That leads to 2, the routine where you pick up that shampoo. And then 3, the reward, where you feel good about your purchase. You feel safer, smarter. And then that leads to the cue again, and around we go. This habit cycle also impacts companies who get a positive feedback from the purchase in terms of sales. And so where we've ended up in the cosmetics industry, I would call the BS bandwagon, where fear marketing historically has taught consumers to expect certain things that have then gone back to the brands, reinforced more fear marketing, allowed entities like the Environmental Working Group to gain traction. Like I said, their pseudoscience is very hard to spot, and it also fits with people's biases for negative information. And so it's an easy fit for what people are more likely to be receptive to. This created room for retailer standards to start to change and adopt some of the language from the Environmental Working Group, which is very compelling from a marketing perspective. Fear sells. And this now is impacting brands, especially when we're talking about small to medium-sized companies who want to sell in a place like Sephora. That's where they would go, and so if they want to sell there, they have to fit their standard. This ultimately creates a market that's increasingly confused, increasingly hard to separate fact from fiction. On the consumer side, consumers are increasingly reaching for products based off of fear, often misplaced, and I think the end outcome of that can be well unpacked with sunscreens. You see this right now. Consumers are afraid of their sunscreen products, and they've been told that a certain type of product, mineral sunscreens, are safer than the chemical sunscreens. And so the data does not support that, A. But what this then translates to is consumers are either foregoing sunscreen or they're reaching for sunscreens that they don't like as much. And we actually have good data for this. We know that as soon as there's more inorganic, the mineral filters, as soon as there's more inorganic filter in the formula, consumer acceptance goes down. And so when consumers have blind testing of sunscreen products, they always prefer the chemical sunscreens, the sunscreens that are demonized. Why is this a problem? Because if we want people to actually wear sunscreen and wear it in sufficient amounts, wear it regularly, they have to actually like the sunscreen. What this might ultimately lead to is, for example, a rise in skin cancer rates. And I know for a fact there are certain researchers that are currently looking at this question. On the market side is creating a huge amount of economic waste due to unnecessary reformulation that we're ultimately doing at the detriment of legitimate progress with respect to sustainability, performance, and safety. Now, turning to environmental misinformation, there are a few things that I think are barriers for finding truth for most people. The first is that environmental impact is complex and is not very well understood. On the screen, I've depicted just a basic life cycle picture of a formulation. I find when people are thinking about environmental impact, they often get tunnel vision to one aspect when it's the whole entirety of a life cycle that determines the final environmental impact. I think plastic packaging gives a really good case for this, where people get so focused on the pollution impacts that they forget the beginning of life benefits with respect to things like material savings or emission savings. And in many cases for cosmetic products that are packaged, if we are actually to measure it and not just assume things, they typically will have environmental benefits compared to other packaging types. What I've just told you is kind of complicated. And so that competes against our bias for simple information. The elephant in the room, anytime we're talking about environmental impact for cosmetic products or any consumerism-focused product is that consumerism is the most impactful thing we do to the environment as a society. And the overwhelming evidence shows that the negative impacts associated with overconsumption have outweighed any of the benefits associated with eco-innovation. We need to consume less. Green consumerism is not the same thing as sustainable consumption. The reality for us in a consumerism-focused industry is that we're not going to achieve sustainability. And when you claim that you have, then this in itself is spreading harmful misinformation. Because then you're teaching consumers to buy more instead of worrying about the things that could actually make a difference, which is consume less. There are ways to think about this. For example, creating hero products as cosmetic brands that help consumers purchase less. Companies can do better. This ultimately is how they should be framing things rather than saying that they've achieved sustainability. Another key challenge is that relevant expertise isn't well understood, and there's no shortage of sustainability experts who don't actually have the relevant expertise for the things that they talk about. This is kind of rampant. Sustainability, just like cosmetics, is massively interdisciplinary. No one has expertise in every facet, and that should be probably a red flag if somebody's talking about all the different facets of sustainability, that maybe they're not a trustworthy expert. Highlighted on the screen is a skill materiality matrix published a few years ago that I really liked on environmental social governance, ESG. And you can see some of the prerequisites for E and the S in G. Obviously, STEM or science background isn't enough. You have to have the relevant science background, but it starts to unravel what relevant subject matter expertise means in this space. It's also emotive, and people want to do, or at least appear to do better. When people see these pictures of birds with their stomachs full of plastic, like that is emotive and you want to do something. An interesting viewpoint was published in Marine Policy a few years ago that highlighted ocean plastic pollution, a convenient but distracting truth. Because today we have almost, if not as much, policy directed at addressing microplastics to save the ocean compared to climate change, certainly with overfishing. And the latter two are greater drivers for ocean impacts. And so it's distracting from the things that we need to do. And it's not to say that we shouldn't do things on microplastics, but we have to understand the context. Doing better requires having the right information, but that is sometimes very difficult. From a corporate point of view, this is disproportionately more difficult for medium to small size companies who often don't have the resources to have like technical staff, especially technical staff who have specialized expertise in this stuff. And this is particularly the case when there are knowledge barriers. For example, when knowledge is being kept behind corporate doors or at high-cost conferences, and not to mention legitimately doing better, which includes understanding your impact, is expensive. For example, if a company were to do a life cycle assessment, which is not a one and done thing, it could be upwards of like $100,000. That is out of reach for most small businesses. On the screen is a depiction of a term called misplaced conservation, which was coined in 2021 by Adam Ford from the University of Alberta. And it highlights how misinformation and polarization can collectively either indirectly or directly harm conservation outcomes. An indirect impact may be, for example, from a misallocation of the slim conservation resources, which then takes away from the resources for actually doing something. A case in their study that I thought was really compelling and explains the concept clearly is with a group of environmental enthusiasts that tried to save monarch butterflies in their region. And so they ended up planting a bunch of milkweed, but it was the wrong milkweed, and it ended up making the problem worse and the population further reduced. Had they had the right information, they would have had a better outcome. A point that really resonated with me in this study was that outcomes, rather than intentions, are the arbitrators of success. conservation success, or whatever else. I feel like a lot of people get really wrapped up around the intent behind misinformation, like that makes that much of a difference for the impact, but it really doesn't. A case example specific to beauty, I think, is sunscreen. And so right now, especially in North America, there is a general idea that sunscreens cause coral bleaching. And this idea really got legs after a study in 2016 that got disproportionate media playtime because of science sensationalism factors compared to the other studies in that field that were published. So this study is actually an outlier study from the body of evidence that largely does not support the idea that any filters cause coral bleaching. This study used extreme exposure scenarios also that weren't relevant to nature to show that certain UV filters cause coral bleaching. Had they done this on, for example, zinc oxide, they would have also seen a bleaching impact, and zinc oxide is allowed. Sunscreen ultimately isn't, seemingly, based off of what we currently understand, the issue for coral bleaching. Rather, it's things like rising water temperatures, which can be attributed to by climate change. However, legislators have now convinced a lot of people that they're solving the problem by banning these filters in the region. My question, is this a case of misplaced conservation? Rapid fire, none of these on the screen equals more environmentally friendly. In every case, it's complex and it depends. I'm going to just lean into one on the screen, one example, which is upcycled, which is right now a trend in beauty with ingredients. Oh, but when you go and look for evidence, often it's lacking. So I'm aware of a recent study that was published in the context of textiles. It was on upcycled leather versus traditional leather. And they actually found that the upcycled leather had a substantially larger environmental impact compared to the non-upcycled leather. And it's because the most impactful parts of that life cycle were actually outside of the boundaries of what upcycling would address. A key point from them was that a lot of the eco trends are driven by assumptions, which are often driven by biases, which often lead us astray, rather than evidence, rather than legitimate measurement. And this is a problem. If there's one takeaway you get from this presentation, it's that panaceas don't work for environmental impact because it's really, really complicated. If a company is telling you that they're greener because of any of these buzzwords, or another one is local, because it's local, I'm environmentally superior, that's not good enough. As the technical audience here today, I would invite you to start just pushing back. I think we can all probably do a better job holding companies accountable. That could even just be asking questions, including asking for evidence behind some of the claims. Misinformation makes it harder to drive positive progress. Crucially important, the environmental issues we face are issues we can't see addressed by single companies, considering all of the different companies acting on all of the different impact factors. It's a systemic problem, and systemic problems need systemic solutions. And that means collaboration across sectors. For that to be productive, we have to have the right information. What can be done? Among many other things, we should have more care in how we communicate with the public and customers. It's really tempting as an ingredient supplier or a brand to label your product as sustainable. So pause before you do that. Rather, think about leaning into the complexity and talking about how you're taking steps to reduce your environmental impact. That could be really productive for helping people understand the nuances of the subject. We should have a willingness to change our opinion with new evidence, especially because of how biases and assumptions really ultimately drive a lot of people's ideas about environmental impact. We could pause before sharing and always keep your skeptic's hat on. if you just slow down a little bit, I mean, this is actually something known for the spread of misinformation in general. If there could be tactics to slow people down, it does a good job slowing the spread of misinformation. There should be efforts for accessible knowledge sharing across industry, and that includes investment in good science communication. And that could look like a lot of different things. For example, science communication between disciplines. For example, with the technical people and the marketing people. Science communication from the big companies to the small companies, from the ingredient suppliers to the brands, just across the whole value chain of cosmetics. From trade associations to legislators, IBA is doing that tomorrow, which is, I mean, really good work in my opinion. One is directed to the public. This should also include investment towards independent science communication who are doing good science communication. The public is losing trust in institutions. They're looking for truth from people that they trust within their communities. If you attended the keynote earlier, Michelle brought this up, how they're looking for trusted messengers. There's a whole area of literature focused on these people as really important for science communication efforts, especially in areas that confront people's preconceptions, to change people's opinions and get them on side on certain topics. So there's a lot of research for trusted messengers in the context of, for example, climate change advocacy or vaccine advocacy. This could also look like science communicators who are on social media, who have communities around them, who already trust them. And finally, there should be more holding companies accountable for the things that they claim, and that can start here today. If you, as you're having conversations with ingredient suppliers and they're making these pithy claims to you, by just asking them questions and asking for evidence. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you to the SCC for giving me the platform to share. For lots more, check out my free eSummit series, podcasts, and SciComms on social media via @theEcoWell or theecowell.com. Thank you so much. And with that, I invite questions if I have time. Do I?